Every woman in Iraq is better off because the rape rooms and torture chambers of Saddam Hussein are forever closed, George W. Bush said during his speech to commemorate International Women's Day. Saddam Hussein's reign in Iraq, which lasted from 1979 to 2003, was characterized by authoritarianism, repression, and a pervasive culture of fear. His regime implemented policies that centralized power, suppressed dissent, and committed gross human rights violations. What were the terrible punishments that Saddam Hussein inflicted on women during his reign? Join us as we unveil Saddam Hussein's reign of horror. Upon ascending to power in 1979, Saddam Hussein swiftly eliminated all forms of political opposition in Iraq, transforming the country into a one-party state centered around his cult of personality. Under his despotic regime, the Iraqi people suffered unimaginable horrors, including executions, torture, imprisonment, rape, terror, and repression. Despite Iraq's rich cultural heritage and a history of intellectual and scientific achievements, particularly among its women, Saddam Hussein's tyrannical rule effectively silenced not only the voices of Iraqi men, but also suppressed the invaluable contributions and potential of its women, using violence and intimidation as tools of control. During Saddam Hussein's regime, women experienced various forms of oppression, discrimination, and human rights abuses. His regime implemented policies that severely restricted women's freedoms and subjected them to systemic mistreatment. Here is a picture of a torture center that has now been turned into a museum. Under Saddam Hussein's rule, Iraqi society was plagued by deep-seated patriarchal norms and oppressive policies that targeted women. The regime propagated a rigid interpretation of Islamic law, imposing strict moral codes and regulations on women's behavior. Women were expected to adhere to conservative dress codes and face severe consequences for any perceived transgressions. Saddam Hussein's regime deployed rape and sexual violence as tools of intimidation and control. Women from various ethnic and religious backgrounds fell victim to these heinous acts. The regime's security forces, including the notorious Fedayeen Saddam, systematically used rape as a weapon against dissidents and their families. Women were subjected to sexual violence in prisons, detention centers, and even their own homes, with impunity granted to the perpetrators. The Iraqi government used rape and sexual assault as tools to extract information, intimidate opposition members, and blackmail cooperation. Videos showing the rape of female family members were sent to oppositionists as a means of intimidation. Some Iraqi authorities even carried identification cards labeling their official activity as the violation of women's honor. Women who dared to challenge the regime's oppressive policies faced brutal punishments. Public floggings, beatings, and torture were routine practices, often carried out in front of large crowds to instill fear and suppress any form of dissent. Women were targeted for minor infractions, such as improper attire or engaging in political activism. The punishments inflicted on women were not only physically agonizing, but also psychologically damaging, leaving lasting scars on their lives. Female dissidents and relatives of oppositionists and defectors were routinely subjected to torture and murder by the Iraqi government. Safiya Hassan, the mother of 2 Iraqi defectors, was killed after criticizing the government for killing of her sons. Women in Saddam's prisons endured brutal beatings, systematic rape, electrical shocks, and branding as forms of torture. Many women were arbitrarily imprisoned, enduring extended periods of confinement in inhumane conditions. They were torn away from their families, with no knowledge of their loved ones' whereabouts or well-being. The pain of separation and the uncertainty of their fate added to the already unbearable suffering endured by these women. Families were left traumatized and torn apart, often with no means of recourse or justice. Saddam Hussein's regime infamously used chemical weapons against its own people, including women and children. The most notorious instance was the 1988 attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja, where thousands were killed and many more suffered severe health complications. Pregnant women were particularly affected, leading to the birth of children with physical and developmental disabilities. The scars of chemical attacks continue to haunt the survivors, both physically and emotionally. The regime resorted to forced disappearances and mass executions as methods to instill fear and maintain control. Women were among the victims, often targeted for their political affiliations or suspected ties to opposition groups. The whereabouts of these women remain unknown, leaving families in a perpetual state of grief and anguish. The fear of sudden arrest or execution pervaded Iraqi society, further suppressing dissent and perpetuating a climate of terror. The paramilitary organization Fedayeen Saddam, led by Uday Hussein, Saddam's eldest son, beheaded over 200 women in public, falsely justifying their actions as a fight against prostitution. Families of the victims were forced to display the severed heads on their fences as a form of psychological torture. Many of the victims were not involved in prostitution, but were targeted for political reasons, such as Najat Mohammed Haidar, an obstetrician who was beheaded after criticizing corruption within the healthcare system. Article 111 of the Iraqi Penal Code, introduced in 1990, granted immunity to men who killed their female relatives in defense of family honor. This provision, aimed at gaining tribal support for Saddam's regime, resulted in thousands of honor killings of women who were seen as bringing shame to their families. Here are some gruesome tales of Saddam Hussein's and his son's brutality. One of the condemned women was pregnant. This presented a problem, said Ahmad, as reported by the Sunday Times London on July 27, 2003. She was several months pregnant, he continued, explaining that the doctor had confirmed her pregnancy and her swollen stomach was evident. Uncertainty surrounded her case as she was taken in and out of confinement 3 times, leaving everyone unsure of what to do. Desperate telephone calls were made to Uday, the representative of his father. Throughout this ordeal, the woman sobbed and pleaded for mercy, especially for the life of her unborn child. Tragically, on the 3rd call, the order was given to proceed with her execution. Despite her pregnancy, the woman was beheaded, leaving Ahmad with a profound sense of sickness. According to the New York Times article published on July 23, 2003, Uday Hussein, the eldest of Saddam Hussein's 5 children, was seen as the embodiment of the Iraqi government's arbitrary brutality. Human rights groups and Iraqi exiles accused Uday of engaging in a pattern of abductions, where he would kidnap women from the streets, subject them to rape and torture, and personally oversee the torture and humiliation of numerous prisoners. As a result of his actions, he acquired the infamous moniker Abu Sarhan, an Arabic term meaning father of the wolf. Contrary to what has been written, Uday was never married and he was obsessed with women. If he spotted a woman he fancied in the street or at a reception, he would send his henchmen to fetch her. Uday's former aide, Agence France Presse, July 22, 2003. The New York Times, in an article published on June 2, 2003, shared the harrowing account of a woman who endured unimaginable suffering at the hands of her tormentors. For a period of 1 year, she was subjected to a cruel cycle of being transferred between prisons, torture centers, and prisons once again. Her captors would suspend her from a ceiling hook by her bound arms, inflicting electric shocks and brutal beatings on her feet until they were swollen, bloody, and her toenails fell off. At the age of 25, she endured these unspeakable horrors. In her own words, she described herself as fortunate to have become like a lifeless body, detached from the reality surrounding her. The conditions were deplorable, with a lack of water, bathrooms, and adequate sustenance. The only available food came in the form of 2 large pots, one filled with dirty rice and the other with soup. Survival meant fighting for sustenance. The strong and healthy would obtain food, while the weak would wait and suffer. Following the period of torture, she faced a mock trial and was subsequently sentenced to spend her life at Rashad Women's Prison. The facility was a labyrinth of unheated cells, where sewage would flow from a single toilet, permeating the corridors and seeping onto the women's uncomfortable mattresses. The inhumane conditions compounded her already unbearable plight. As reported by the New York Times on June 2, 2003, Surya Abdel Kader, a survivor of Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, shared her most haunting recollection, an experience where she became numb to everything except her own anguish. After enduring relentless beatings and electric shocks, she would often find herself back in the wretched confines of a fetid cell, so overcrowded that prisoners had no choice but to stand. In this nightmarish environment, women would succumb to death, collapsing to the floor. Yet Miss Abdel Kader recalled feeling only a faint annoyance at the sight, thinking to herself, "Get this body out of the way, it's taking up room." Her imprisonment was a result of her 4 brothers' arrest during Saddam Hussein's widespread crackdown on Shiite individuals suspected of supporting Iran or the Islamic Dawa Party. The suffering inflicted upon her was not due to any personal transgressions, but rather the consequences of being associated with those targeted by the regime's oppressive measures. These tales of brutality must have given you goosebumps, as Saddam Hussein's reign was full of terror and torture for women. These horrific acts perpetrated against women under Saddam Hussein's reign reflect a complete disregard for human rights dignity, and gender equality.